This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Telly Edwards. Tonight's top stories. 13 people detained for suspected manslaughter after Hong Kong's deadliest fire in decades, with authorities finding the use of shoddy renovation materials that did not match standards. Now, new data shows that revenues at China's military giants slumped last year, even as global arms sales surged, with Japan and South Korea posting double-digit growth. China's central bank toughening its stance on virtual currencies, vowing a crackdown on illegal stablecoin activity. The warning sends related stocks in Hong Kong tumbling. And early results from Honduras presidential election show Trump-backed candidate Nazri Asfura, who's open to ties with Taiwan, holding a slim lead. Also in the bulletin, Japan's Princess Aiko turns 24, and her supporters want her considered as a future monarch. The call is challenging Japan's male-only succession law that's been in place since the late 19th century. Hong Kong authorities are pointing to substandard renovation materials for fueling the city's deadliest blaze in decades that claimed at least 151 lives. Well, police are pressing on with the search for those still missing at Wong Fuk Court complex in Tai Po, which they say will likely take weeks. Well, CNA's Deborah Wong joins us now with the very latest from Hong Kong. Deborah, what is the latest from investigations?
So authorities just had a press conference earlier and they mentioned that 7 out of the 20 samples of the scaffolding net that they've taken from the burn site were found to be not meeting fire safety standards. In short, they were non-compliant material. And they also found that upon investigation, following the damage from a typhoon earlier this year in July, the contractors had actually replaced some of the damaged netting with substandard material, non-compliant ones, and basically putting them in places where, it's quite inaccessible, where only firemen could reach if they did some maintenance works. And, the whole point of this, for the contractor's perspective, was to evade government inspection. And Chief Secretary of Administration, Eric Chan, who presided the press conference, called these methods extremely cunning, and he also condemned them and said that this amounted to an act of crime. So far, 13 people have been arrested, and these include engineering consultants, contractors, as well as scaffolding foremen. Now, the victim identification unit from the police also conducted a press conference slightly later, and they mentioned that searches at 5 out of the 7 burnt buildings have already been completed. They've recovered 5 bodies so far. 39 bodies are still awaiting identification, and the bodies they found were scattered all across the corridors as well as the units. And they're now commencing searches in the remaining 2 buildings. And they mentioned that, searches will take some time because it's not just combing the burn sites for bodies, but it's also combing the site for any evidence they can find. So we expect this entire process to be completed in about 3 weeks. Now, it was a fairly emotional press conference for the police earlier. There were at some point, several of the speakers broke down in tears and they were trying to restrain themselves. So it's a very emotional period for the operating staff on site as well. And we understand that the police have, in fact, organized a memorial service for the victims' families to attend just in front of the burn site. In fact, we were there earlier and we did see the entire park in front of the burn site transform into a memorial site of sorts. There was a pavilion with tons of messages around telling residents of Tai Po to keep fighting, messages of condolences also, and all across the memorial site leading to the MTR station, which is about a 15-minute walk away. There were people continuously streaming in with flowers, laying them on the ground as well. So it really was a picture of solidarity under the shadow of such a tragedy. Otelli.
Hey, thanks for that report. CNA's Deborah Wong in Hong Kong. Police have completed sweeps at 4 of the 7 towers of Wong Fuk Court estate that were engulfed in last Wednesday's inferno. Well, they say the 3 remaining buildings are the, quote, difficult ones to search, and that the sweep will likely take 3 weeks to complete. Meanwhile, thousands are turning up near the site in an outpouring of grief as the city mourns the territory's deadliest fire in decades.
Hong Kong residents have been turning up in droves to pay their respects to the victims of the devastating disaster. Mourners formed queues, reportedly nearly 2 kilometers long. The government is promising financial help and has pledged to rehouse the more than 1,800 residents displaced by the fire. China has warned against any disruptive actions as multiple online petitions call for a proper probe into the blaze.
當然，我估災民上要幫佢哋嘅嘢有好多，咁但係另一樣就無論喺政策上定係點，我估呢啲都係下一步應該要去處理嘅嘢。
希望政府能夠有一個獨立嘅調查啦，同埋希望可以有問責啦。
The housing estate in Tai Po had been under renovation, with scrutiny now on the bamboo scaffolding and mesh wrapped around the buildings. Nearly a week into the disaster, authorities have searched 4 of the 7 blocks affected by the fire. Bodies were found in apartments, staircases, hallways, and rooftops. Police expect to take up to 4 weeks to complete their search, saying the lack of lighting is slowing them down.
現場嘅工作環境相當惡劣，即使喺日間有少少陽光嘅情況之下，由窗口進入嘅光線係已經唔足夠嘅。
The fire has also put the spotlight on Hong Kong's dependence on foreign domestic workers. 7 Indonesians and 1 Filipino were killed in the blaze. The Indonesian Migrant Workers Union held a prayer tribute to the fire victims. It's urging the Indonesian government to help provide more skills to cope with living in Hong Kong.
Jadi saya berharap pemerintah Indonesia karena menyerahkan pendidikannya kepada PT sehingga pendidikannya ya murni bahasa. Bahasa memang diperlukan, tapi pertolongan pertama ini bukan hanya tentang bagaimana mereka bekerja di tempat yang khusus karena mereka tahu Hong Kong adalah negara bertingkat, gedung, apartemen dan sebagainya.
The Filipino community also gathered to offer their prayers and tributes. One domestic worker in particular, Rodora Alcaraz, has been hailed for her bravery, rescuing her employer's 3-month-old baby in a wet blanket. Ms. Alcaraz remains in hospital. Her former employer commended her.
I was feeling sick to my stomach when her sister, Dory, was messaging me and sending the voice messages na nasa fire siya, holding the baby. But it's so like her. Nakakaiyak. It's so like her to put her life on the line for someone else. Kasi talagang very caring talaga siya.
Authorities have confirmed that the fire alarms at the complex had failed, leaving residents without warning as the blaze quickly spread. It's also been revealed that safety concerns about construction materials used had been raised last year, but no action was taken.
A new study shows that revenues at China's military giants fell last year, even as overall arms sales around the world surged. Well, the report by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, shows that revenues of China's top weapons makers dropped 10% last year. In contrast, revenue for arms makers in Japan went up 40%, Germany 36%, and South Korea 31%. While the increase at U.S. firms was 4%. Well, the decline was mostly felt by Chinese state-owned arms makers, with Norinco, China's largest ground-based weapons producer, seeing the sharpest drop of 31%. The revenue fall comes despite 30 years of China's rising defense budgets amid its rivalry with the U.S. and tensions over Taiwan and in the South China Sea. SIPRI researchers say a host of corruption allegations in Chinese arms procurement led to delays and even cancellations of major contracts in 2024. But the Swedish think tank expects sustained Chinese investment in defense in the medium and longer term as China pushes on with its military modernization. The People's Liberation Army was one of the main targets of President Xi Jinping's wider corruption crackdown this year. 8 top military leaders were expelled from the Communist Party on graft charges in October, including the country's number 2 general. Observers say they are still trying to gauge the impact of the crackdown on China's military. And Arnold Gay breaks down the report that showed last year's military spending worldwide hitting a record high.
CIPRI says the world's biggest defense manufacturers brought in $679 billion in 2024. That's up nearly 6% over the previous year. And over the longer period from 2015 to 2024, revenues grew 26% as producers capitalized on high demand. Researchers say the surge is mostly driven by Europe, with demand increasing in every region except Asia and Oceania. A major part of that demand came from Ukraine and from countries supporting Kyiv, which now need to replenish their own stockpiles. CIPRI says many European countries are also looking to expand and modernize their militaries, and this trend expected to push sales higher. The U.S. is home to the largest number of major defense companies, 39 of the top 100. U.S. manufacturers brought in $334 billion last year. That's nearly half of all global arms revenues. Though CIPRI notes that production delays and budget overruns held back some deliveries as well. In Europe, companies are also struggling to keep up with rising demand. Some firms that used to rely on titanium from Russia before 2022 have been forced to find new suppliers. While meantime, Chinese restrictions on critical minerals have led manufacturers to warn of higher costs as they restructure supply chains. In Asia, CIPRI says the picture is mixed. Overall revenue slipped slightly, down about 1%, mainly because of a sharper drop among Chinese defense companies after corruption allegations led to cancelled contracts. But Japanese, South Korean weapons makers saw sales rise, fueled by growing demand from European buyers.
And more to unpack from this report, we'll have to speak with the director of the Swedish think tank's Military Expenditure and Arms Production Program, who will be joining us later this hour. Well, time now for a short break, but coming up on East Asia Tonight, Japan plans to foster crypto trading in the domestic market by aligning tax rules for cryptocurrencies with those for equities. And South Korea's e-commerce giant Coupang issues an apology over a massive data breach, reigniting concerns about online security. Hello again, you're watching East Asia Tonight. And we've got Roland Lim now joining us for the business news. Roland, fresh signs that China's economy is sputtering despite all that trade truce with the US. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, the latest clues actually point to a tired consumer, soft jobs market, as well as property drag that just won't go away. Now, China's economic slowdown has deepened, with its factory slump hitting its longest stretch ever, even after the trade truce with the US. Official data showed factory activity ticked higher in November, but remained in contraction for an 8th straight month. Non-manufacturing PMI, which measures construction and services, contracted for the first time in nearly 3 years as the boost from the Golden Week holiday faded. Still, analysts expect China to meet its target of around 5% GDP growth for this year, meaning that policymakers would likely hold off any major stimulus until at least early next year. Meantime, a private survey on Chinese factory activity also unexpectedly slipped into contraction in November. The rating dog China manufacturing PMI dropped just below the 50 mark, which separates growth and contraction, missing analyst estimates. Rating dog says new export orders following the US-China trade truce failed to offset the prolonged weakness in the manufacturing sector. Markets are brushing aside the domestic economic concerns lifted by optimism that the Fed may cut rates later this month. At the close, Shanghai Composite Index advancing 0.65%, while smaller Shenzhen Index is up more than 1%. In Hong Kong, the Hang Seng Index is 0.67% higher. Sean Yokota of SEB explains why he's optimistic about China's prospects in the new year.
Yes, I think it works and gels with the weekend numbers, the official numbers as well. So you are seeing this slowdown in manufacturing And I think the tariffs are kicking in, and it's going to have a bit of an issue. I think you can hit the 5% because the first half was such a good numbers, so that even if you get quite a bit of slowdown, you still hit this 5% target. But China's, I think, slowed down for good reasons. Especially in the middle of the year, they started this cutting down on overcapacity. So manufacturing investment is down, the involution. So that's actually a good thing. And also, they're not spending that much money from the local and the central government on these infrastructure projects. And like everybody else, they're worried about such high debt levels that they don't want to borrow more money and then spend it on that. Yeah, so overall, because the things are weak in China, the sentiment remains weak in China. But I think in China, people tend to get over negative about things. So from our point of view, we're looking for an uptick surprises next year. And the two places you see it are the tariffs. It was talked about this year, but it seems like things are better on the relationship. They're going to meet in April, Trump and Xi. And as well as some of this services consumption, we're seeing a little bit of an uptick on that. And that's one engine that hasn't been really developed. And I think that can support the Chinese economy next year.
China's central bank is clamping down on virtual currency, sending cryptocurrency-related stocks in Hong Kong tumbling. The latest move by the People's Bank of China, or PBOC, comes after a wave of high-profile arrests involving billions of dollars worth of crypto from Chinese businessmen. The PBOC banned crypto trading back in 2021, but this is the first time the bank has mentioned stablecoins. Minutes from the bank's meeting over the weekend says stablecoins do not meet anti-money laundering requirements. Shares of crypto brokers and digital asset companies tanked following the bank's pronouncement, which has cast a shadow over Hong Kong's crypto ambitions. The territory has been looking to position itself as a digital asset hub and passed a stablecoin bill earlier this year, which set up a legal framework for the fiat-based cryptocurrency. But Chinese tech giants Ant Group and JD.com have put their plans to issue stablecoins in Hong Kong on hold after the PBOC raised concerns back in October. Japan, too, preparing a major overhaul for its tax rules for digital assets, but it's to foster crypto trading in the country. The government and ruling coalition plan to impose a flat 20% tax on gains from cryptocurrency trading, bringing it in line with taxes on equities and other financial products. Nikkei Asia reports the change is expected to be written into the 2026 tax reform plan. It will replace the current progressive system where crypto gains can be taxed as high as 55%. Officials hope the simpler, lower tax rate will boost domestic trading and support growth in blockchain-related industries. Japan now has around 8 million active crypto accounts, with September trading volumes hitting nearly $10 billion. A major move from Sony, which could reshape how Americans pay for games and digital content. According to the Nikkei, Sony Bank plans to launch a US dollar peg stablecoin as early as fiscal 2026. Now, a stablecoin is a type of digital currency backed by assets such as government bonds to keep the value steady. Now, Sony sees the technology as a way to cut transaction fees and let users pay for games, anime, and subscriptions seamlessly across its ecosystem. Now, Sony Bank filed for US banking license in October and plans to create a new subsidiary to manage the operation. It has also partnered with American venture Bastion, which already issues stablecoins to build the necessary infrastructure. The Sony Group earned over 30% of its revenues from US customers last fiscal year, and adopting a stablecoin could strengthen its foothold in that market. The consumer electronics giant shares ending the day 3.5% lower in Tokyo, 4,415 yen apiece. Japan's corporate spending is showing signs of strain after months of pressure from higher US tariffs and weakening business confidence. Japanese firms trimmed capital expenditure over the summer, ending 5 straight quarters of gains. New data from the Finance Ministry shows that capital expenditure on goods, excluding software, slipped 0.3% in the July to September period. This is despite corporate profits jumping by the most in 2 years. Investments, including software, rose around 3% compared with a year earlier, while profits jumped nearly 20%. The weaker spending is expected to drag third quarter GDP lower, with economists warning that the initial 1.8% contraction could be revised deeper into negative territory when new figures are released next week. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi is hoping to counter the slowdown with a $10.3 billion stimulus package. That's Japan's largest since the pandemic. But firms remain cautious, partly because of President Trump's 15% tariff on all Japanese imports. Exports to the U.S. fell more than 10% over the summer. And all this comes as the Bank of Japan weighs its next move. With wage growth still expected to hold up, analysts say the BOJ may continue to prepare for a possible rate hike at its meeting on December 19th. South Korea's trade momentum kept its pace, with exports rising for a sixth consecutive month in November, beating market expectations. That's as chip sales hit records on strong technology demand, while autos also jumped after a U.S. trade deal. Outbound shipments from Asia's fourth largest economy, a bellwether for global trade, rose 8.4% on year to $61 billion. Semiconductor exports rose 38.5% to a record monthly high of around $17.3 billion. This, as strong demand for advanced chips used in data centers, led to higher memory chip prices. Auto exports jumped nearly 14% as uncertainty was cleared over U.S. tariffs after South Korea finalized a trade deal with the U.S. in November. Still, shipments to the U.S. edged down slightly as steel products, machinery, and auto parts fell due to tariff impact. The Bank of Korea signaled last week it was near the end of its monetary easing cycle as it raised its economic growth forecast for next year on strong semiconductor exports. The trade-reliant economy grew in the third quarter at the strongest pace in a year and a half. Quick check on South Korean benchmark equity index ending the day at 3,920 points. Meanwhile, the Korean won also slightly weakened against the greenback, 1,469.68 to the dollar. South Korea's largest online retailer, Coupang, has apologized after a major data breach. Personal information such as emails, shipping addresses, and phone numbers of 34 million customers was potentially compromised. That's about 2/3 of the country's entire population. CEO Park Tae-jun issued the apology as the government convened an emergency meeting, saying that it is investigating whether the company violated data protection rules. Coupang says it discovered the breach on October 18th, while authorities believe it should have started on June 24th through overseas servers. Local media reports that a Chinese former employee is suspected to be behind the incident. The leak marks the latest in a string of high-profile data breaches in South Korea. Last week, the country's largest crypto exchange, Upbit, was hacked. SK Telecom, the country's largest mobile carrier, was fined $97 million earlier this year for failing to safeguard customer data. Meantime, internet postings show that more than 10,000 people are planning to join a possible class action lawsuit against Coupang, seeking compensation of more than 10,000 won or $68 per person. Shares of global cybersecurity company Ant Lab rose as much as 8% in Seoul before pairing off those sharp gains as the incident sparked fresh interest in online security. Quick check on precious metals. Gold is currently trading at $4,258.96 an ounce. Silver, $57.68. Now, silver, the white metal, hitting new record today as expectations rise over the U.S. Fed cutting rates later this month. Bullion has rallied this year as investors perceive them to be safe havens to hedge against the global uncertainty, increasing government debt, and falling U.S. dollar. Gold has already increased by more than 60% from a year ago, while silver is up more than 85% the same period. Gold's rally, however, is taking a toll on China's jewelers, who have reportedly closed hundreds of shops due to a slump in sales. The Financial Times says the country's biggest jeweler, Chow Tai Fook has shuttered more than a tenth of its stores on the mainland. China has also cut a decades-long tax rebate on consumer gold, adding to jewelers' burdens and threatens to compound an already sluggish consumption market. The country is the world's biggest consumer market for the precious metal. Despite the closures, Chow Tai Fook says it is consolidating its locations by focusing on more affluent cities. Chow Tai Fook shares ending the day 3.59% higher. Luk Fook is up by 5.74%. Lao Pu is also 2% higher, but it is down more than a third from its July high. And that is the latest in business. Ochelle.
Thanks very much for that, Roland. All right, on that note, we are going to go for a short break now, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, Honduras is counting the votes for a presidential election that will decide whether or not the country resumes diplomatic ties with Taiwan. And Australia announces its biggest defense shake-up in decades that will see the creation of a new agency. Hello again, this is East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. Hong Kong investigators point to substandard renovation materials as the main cause of the city's deadliest fire in decades. 13 people are facing manslaughter charges. Cryptocurrency-related stocks tumble in Hong Kong after China's central bank promises to crack down on illegal stablecoin activity. And a new study finds China's arms giants falling behind their global counterparts as President Xi Jinping's anti-corruption measures lead to delays and even cancelled contracts. Now, that study on arms sales was conducted by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and I'm going to bring in now one of the report's authors, Dr. Nan Tien. He joins us from the Swedish capital. Well, thanks for joining us this evening, Dr. Nan Tien. Now, first up, I want to start with events inside China itself, where in your report, it's mentioned that perhaps a corruption probe has swept through China's defense sector. Tell us, what does that mean and the sort of impact it will have around China's military modernization efforts?
I mean, so far, of course, these purges have really impacted the industry itself and also the domestic procurement contracts within the Chinese military organizations. And I think what we'll likely see is that there will be kind of delays, cancellations of these contracts, and so particularly impacting the rocket forces, the aerospace programs, which will essentially lead to uncertainties whether it can match its short-term goals like the 2027 milestone on capability and readiness.
Yeah, and what's also interesting to note is that based on that report, we're seeing Chinese aviation and shipbuilding, that's all going up, but it's the land systems makers. So we're talking about the tanks, the artillery, the armored vehicles, all of that sharply down. So, Dr. Nanjin, what does this reveal about perhaps Beijing's shifting military position?
I think in the long term, it hasn't really changed its long-term military modernization plans. But I think, in the short term, given that, the crackdown has, not limited to top company leaders, but has also led to mid-level procurement officers and technical staff, both in the military and civilian sector, it is likely that, it will lead to kind of supply chain disruptions throughout the land system sector. And this problem, essentially, given, the opaqueness of which the Chinese official has been reporting, was likely going to be much broader and deeper than what we have seen officially.
So that also brings us to the question of where the money is really going. Dr. Nanchin, to what extent Beijing sort of redirecting funds towards other strategic systems? Do we know what exactly are we talking about? Nuclear forces, space capabilities and AI? Is that where they're directing the funds to these days?
Indeed, when we look at some of the Chinese military modernization plans, there's been a focus on space, on hypersonic missiles. The country has also been kind of expanding its nuclear forces. So the number of nuclear warheads that are being deployed and stored has also increased in recent years. And essentially, a lot of this has to kind of target both to counter the military modernization and nuclear modernization we see in the US, but also kind of to keep track with what has already been specified by President Xi as kind of this long-term effort to build China to be a world-leading military force by 2049.
And when it comes to sourcing materials, as you know, the dependence on critical minerals, do you think this could pose some sort of a challenge if China decides to tighten its export controls?
I mean, indeed. I mean, China has been using kind of, export control regulations in its tit for tat with the US over the last kind of 3 years. And so I think the tightening of export controls will most likely impact Western producers, which often rely on, of course, both the minerals, rare earth minerals from China, but also the processing capabilities that China possesses in kind of turning, of course, rare earths into certain components that fit into US and European weapon systems.
And let's just pick up on the demand side story here, because a surprise report highlights buyers shifting away from Chinese systems. What specific concerns do you think there are that's sort of driving this shift?
So when we look at kind of, the decrease in Chinese arms exports in recent years, it is not the result of countries buying less Chinese weapons or moving away to other suppliers, but rather it's about kind of the procurement cycles from the buyer country, as well as production and delivery cycles from Chinese companies. What we'll likely see with some of these purges, given that it's impacting domestic procurement programs, is that some of the orders that come from, let's say, Pakistan might actually move up in the backlog of Chinese arms company production and might actually lead to faster delivery than expected.
Interesting. And actually, when you put all of that together, the regional picture could look quite different, because we also have South Korea and Japan, and they surged ahead, double digits, in fact, while China seems to have stumbled here. But are we witnessing a shift, do you think, in terms of Asia's defense industrial balance of power? I
mean, indeed, we have seen this dramatic shift first in Japanese kind of defense industrial capabilities, but also its national security strategy, where since 2022 the country has really ramped up its military procurement and military spending, leading to more orders, more production, in a way reacting to the geopolitical uncertainty around the world, but also to the rise of China as a military power within the region. South Korea itself has benefited from increased demand from European countries as they try to build up its armed forces from this perceived threat of Russia, and being unable to kind of procure the weapons European themselves. They have looked to South Korea as one possible supplier. So I think overall we're starting to see a balance where both South Korean and Japanese companies are becoming world leading and some of the biggest arms producers in both the region and the world.
And also these numbers come with the caveats about transparency. So I want to talk about SIPRI's numbers. I mean, basically they are based on companies' disclosures, right? And just given how limited public information we have on Chinese defense spending, curious to know, Dr. Nan Tien, how wide do you think the margin of error is when we talk about a decline in China's defense industry revenues?
I mean, indeed, what we capture within the top 100 is, of course, only the largest Chinese arms companies. There'll be a host of smaller companies that do not provide any level of transparency, which means that likely what we have estimated as Chinese arms revenue is underestimate. And so, of course, the numbers could be much higher, but also the impact that the corruption, scandals and purges have could be much wider and larger than expected. But this, of course, leads into the systematic issue with defense procurement, is that it's known to be one of the most corrupt kind of practices around the world. And the Chinese case is kind of case in point of what's happening both in China, but also is a risk, I think, to keep in mind for other countries around the world when it comes to their domestic arms procurement contracts.
Some great points you've made there. Thank you so very much for your time and thoughts, Dr. Nan Tien, a Program Director of SIPRI's Military Expenditure and Arms Production Program. In other news, Australia has announced a major shake-up of the country's Defence Department, creating a new delivery agency that the government says will improve budgets as well as timelines. Defence Minister Richard Marles says that the reforms are significant for Australia, adding that it will change the way defence operates. Now, the new organization will help manage billions of dollars of complex defense and military projects. Operations begin in July 2026, with the agency set to become standalone the following year. It will be led by a new national armaments director. Mr. Miles added that the changes will be much more cost-effective as the country plans to spend an extra $45.8 billion on defense over the next decade. The minister also confirmed that Australia is tracking a Chinese Navy flotilla in the Philippine Sea amid concerns it may be heading towards Australian waters. It comes months after a Chinese naval task group unexpectedly sailed near Australia's coastline. Well, Mr. Miles says it is too early to tell if the latest flotilla is headed towards the country, but he did affirm that officials will continue to track its progress. Honduras is counting votes from the presidential election, results of which could result in resuming diplomatic ties with Taiwan. Two conservative frontrunners have pledged to refresh relations with the self-ruled island, potentially setting back their country's ties with China. Early results, meantime, show Nasri Asfura, leader of the right-wing National Party, maintaining a narrow lead with 41% of the vote. Trailing him is television host Salvador Nasralla with 39%. And in third place is left-wing candidate Rixi Moncada. Whoever wins a simple majority will govern the country over the next 5 years. Well, candidates Asfura and Nasralla have blamed incumbent President Xiomara Castro for ending ties with Taiwan. They say President Castro's promises for Chinese investment failed to materialize. Taiwan used to be the biggest market for Honduran shrimp, but imports have slumped since diplomatic ties were cut. Now we've got CNA's senior correspondent Victoria Jen join us live from Taipei. Vic, the Trump-backed front-runner has vowed to switch ties from China to Taiwan. How do you think this is going to affect cross-strait tensions?
Well, this development adds another layer of sensitivity to already tense cross-strait relations. Beijing sees diplomatic recognition as a core sovereignty issue. So the idea of a country switching back to Taiwan, especially one that only moved to Beijing in 2023, would be highly embarrassing for China. And the fact that the frontrunner is openly backed by Donald Trump only heightens that pressure. It signals that Washington is supportive of a shift towards Taipei, and Beijing is certainly taking note. Now, the timing also matters. The new president-elect only takes office in January, and analysts here say that creates a vulnerable transition window. China is expected to use this period to apply very heavy pressure on Honduras to stop any move back towards Taiwan. Now, Beijing has used this playbook before, offering quick loans, fast-track projects, or direct political engagement to secure diplomatic loyalty. And for Taiwan, this means cross-strait tensions could rise in the coming weeks. And if China feels it's losing ground diplomatically, it often reacts more assertively, whether through military signaling around Taiwan, sharper rhetoric, or increased pressure on Taiwan's remaining diplomatic partners. And this is just not about Honduras. It also touches directly on China's larger strategy to isolate Taipei on the global stage.
So, Vic, as you've mentioned, cross-strait tensions may rise in the coming weeks. How then is Taiwan responding to the possibility that Honduras may actually restore diplomatic ties?
Well, Taiwan is responding with extreme caution. The foreign ministry is declining to comment for now, and that silence is intentional. Taipei does not want to appear as if it's interfering in Honduras' political process, especially when China is watching closely for any sign of involvement. But despite the very low public profile, Taiwan is clearly paying attention. As far as a repeated pledge to restore ties, combined with Trump's public backing, signals a real possibility that Honduras may reconsider its relationship with Beijing. That combination of local and U.S. political support is something Taipei hasn't seen for years, after a long period of losing diplomatic partners to China. At the same time, Taipei knows this is not guaranteed. The outgoing Honduran administration still has ties with Beijing, and China is almost certain to mount an intense lobbying effort during the transition. Taiwan understands that any public celebration or premature comment could trigger backlash or complicate the political environment in Honduras. So Taiwan's posture right now is deliberate and strategic. Stay silent, avoid giving China an entry point to push back harder, and be ready to act quickly if the new Honduran government follows through. Atali?
Many thanks for that analysis, senior correspondent Victoria Jen in Taipei. Well, we are going to go for another break now, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, Pakistan wants to deepen ties with Japan, but its relations with China may be in the way. Plus, Walt Disney's Zootopia 2 smashes China's box office, raking in $275 million in under a week. In South Korea, the leader of the Unification Church is on trial, accused of bribing former First Lady Kim Yong-hee with luxury items. The corruption case is part of a probe into ousted President Yoon Suk-yeol and his wife following his short-lived martial law decree in December last year. Well, prosecutors accuse Han of providing Kim with 2 Chanel handbags, a diamond necklace, and wild ginseng in exchange for business and political favors. Han denied the bribery accusations, calling them false information. She faces a separate trial next week for allegedly ordering more than 2,000 church members to join Yoon's People Power Party to sway an internal vote. In the meantime, prosecutors are pursuing high-profile figures tied to last year's martial law decree. Seoul Mayor Oh Se-hoon has been indicted for violating political funding laws. A special prosecutor says he used a power broker to run an opinion poll and had a third party pay for it. Oh, who is a senior figure in the Conservative People Power Party, has denied any wrongdoing. Pakistan is looking to reset its relationship with Japan, saying that the change of leadership in Tokyo is an opportunity to build and strengthen economic ties. But analysts warn that Pakistan's close alliance with Beijing may limit how far new relationships can go. Hira Mustafa files this report for CNA from Islamabad.
Japanese cars have long been a symbol of quality and reliability in Pakistan's auto market. From small hatchbacks to luxury sedans, they dominate dealership floors and city streets alike. Much of this demand is met through private importers like Haji Basir, who brings in both new and second-hand models.
और जापानीज़ गाड़ी बेसिकली यूजिंग में भी जो है ना वहाँ बहुत अच्छा यूज़ होते हैं, कम चले होते हैं, तो मजबूत भी होता है और उसकी लाइफ भी होती है और उसकी जो है ना मार्केट में डिमांड भी बहुत ज़्यादा है.
Pakistan imports millions of dollars worth of cars, machinery and steel from Japan, with imports growing by 28% in the 1 year to August 2025. But its own exports to Japan, mostly textile and cotton products, fell by 10% in the same period. Government representatives believe this trade deficit of more than $126 million can be fixed. They say proactive engagement with Japan's new leadership can help sell Pakistan's value in a wider range of sectors.
Japan, of course, is now a very advanced industrial economy and has little use for most of the raw materials that Pakistan produces. But Pakistan could be a tremendous partner to Japan in its own effort to gain IT expertise and IT depth and IT services.
Mr. Dastagir says with its growing IT sector, Pakistan can be a cost-effective source of talent and services for Japan. But observers warn that Islamabad's long-standing defense and trade links with Beijing could complicate ties with Tokyo, given Japan's own tense rivalry with China.
Experts say Pakistan's close relationship with China is one of the main reasons its ties with Japan have drifted. But they caution that as Pakistan moves to remedy the situation, it will need to tread carefully, taking into account not just China, but the wider geopolitical picture.
Diplomatic analysts point to Japan's membership of the Quad, a regional security grouping that also includes the US, India, and Australia.
Japan is part of Quad, which is a security dialogue against China and its ally Pakistan. The issue in South China Sea also, Pakistan has a very clear position on that, which is not how Japan looks at it.
Analysts say Pakistan should focus on attracting investment, given its priority to improve its struggling economy. A potential partner is the Japan International Cooperation Agency, which is already supporting development projects in the country.
We can have a broader kind of arrangement with Japanese in terms of investment in our energy sector and in the agriculture sector. So I think these are the two core areas to me where the JICA can play its role, and also the both government.
Pakistan's outreach to Japan is part of a wider push to build and deepen economic ties across Asia, as seen in Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif's October trip to Malaysia. For 20 years, no Pakistani head of government has officially visited Japan, and observers hope this will now change under the new Takeichi administration. For CNA, I'm Hira Mustafa in Islamabad.
Japan's Princess Aiko turns 24 today, and her birthday is reigniting debate over Japan's royal family succession. Since stepping into the public stage in 2021, the emperor's only child has become a fan favorite. Crowds often chant her name louder than her parents, and a confident solo tour to Laos this year only deepened that affection. But Princess Aiko's popularity isn't enough to place her in line to the chrysanthemum throne. Under a 1947 imperial house law, only men in the male line may reign, and that leaves just two heirs, 60-year-old Crown Prince Akishino and his 19-year-old son, Prince Hisahito. If Hisahito has no sons, a 1,500-year dynasty could end. And finally, Walt Disney's new animated film, Zootopia 2, has broken box office records in China, pulling in $275 million within the 6 days of its release. Well, that makes it the biggest grossing foreign animation film in the country. The movie about a rabbit cop and her fox partner has a huge following in China, even though the original film was released 9 years ago. Disney has steadily expanded the franchise's presence, even opening a dedicated Zootopia-themed park at Shanghai Disneyland.
相比较第二部更好看一点，因为就是比第一部里面多了2个人物，就一条蛇和一个那个河狸。
算，因为买了很多他的周边，然后我朋友也是，我们2个一起约了看。他是厦门人，然后他特地跑到上海，我们一起约了看这个电影。
China has been an unpredictable market for Hollywood films because of geopolitical tensions with the US and censorship rules. Cinemas reported Zootopia sales accounted for about 95% of all movie tickets sold over its opening weekend. And I hope you've enjoyed Monday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. And you can always find us on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for watching.